AETA for refusing to pay off my sister's $300,000 in student loans after our dad left me his entire $10 million estate. Hello, Reddit I plus here. Throwaway account because several family members use Reddit, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this somehow found its way back to them. I'm 32 years old. My sisters are 35 and 37. For the last 8 months, my phone has barely stopped ringing. I've been called selfish, greedy, heartless, vindictive, and even told that my father would be ashamed of me if he could see what I've become. The ironic part? The people saying that are the same people who barely spoke to my father during the last decade of his life. I need outside opinions because this whole situation has become so ridiculous that I'm starting to question my own judgment. To understand why I'm refusing to pay off my sister's student loans, you have to know what actually happened to our family. Growing up, my dad, Martin, was the kind of father every kid deserves. He never missed a baseball game. He built tree houses with me every summer. He somehow managed to work 60-hour weeks while still making it home for dinner almost every night. He started a small construction company in his 20s with one pickup truck and a handful of tools. By the time I finished college, he'd turned it into one of the most respected commercial contracting businesses in our region. He wasn't flashy. He drove the same truck for nearly 15 years because he hated wasting money. His philosophy was simple. If it still works, why replace it? My mother, Elaine, was the complete opposite. She loved expensive vacations, luxury handbags, designer clothes, and being the center of attention. As a kid, I didn't notice the difference. I thought they balanced each other out. My sisters absolutely adored our mom. She was fun. She let them skip school for shopping trips. She always took their side whenever they got into trouble. Dad was the one who enforced rules. Homework came before television. Part-time jobs started at 16. If we wanted something expensive, we were expected to earn part of the money ourselves. Looking back, I realized he wasn't being strict. He was trying to prepare us for adulthood. My sisters saw it differently. By the time they reached college, they complained that Dad was controlling and old-fashioned. Mom encouraged those complaints. She'd whisper things like, your father just doesn't understand strong women. At the time, none of us realized she was quietly driving a wedge between us. Everything exploded when I was 19. Dad had gone out of town for a 3-day business conference. The second evening, he called home because he'd forgotten to email an important file to one of his project managers. Mom didn't answer. Neither did my sisters. He assumed everyone was out together. The next morning, he came home early because the conference ended ahead of schedule. He wasn't supposed to be back until that evening. Instead, he walked into our house just after 9 in the morning. He found my mother having breakfast in our kitchen. She wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was Greg, Dad's business partner for almost 18 years. Greg wasn't just a coworker. He had been in our home hundreds of times. He came to birthdays, Christmas dinners, my graduation. Dad used to call him his brother. According to the private investigator Dad hired later, the affair had been going on for almost 3 years. 3 years. They'd been using business trips as excuses to meet. Greg had even attended family events while secretly sleeping with my mother. The betrayal nearly destroyed Dad. I still remember the expression on his face that afternoon. He looked 20 years older. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He simply sat in his office, staring at the floor for hours. That silence scared me more than any shouting ever could have. The divorce became vicious almost immediately. Mom didn't deny the affair. Instead, she rewrote history. According to her, she'd only cheated because Dad had neglected her. She claimed he loved work more than his family. She cried in front of my sisters. She painted herself as the lonely wife who had finally reached her breaking point. And my sisters believed every single word. Almost overnight, they treated Dad like he was the villain. When the court divided the assets, Mom received several $1,000,000, a lake house, and substantial monthly support, while the business restructuring was finalized. Most people would have walked away satisfied. Not Mom. She wanted the company too. When the judge refused, she spent months telling anyone who would listen that Dad had manipulated the legal system. My sisters echoed every accusation. Family dinners disappeared, holiday traditions ended. Birthdays became awkward. Eventually, they stopped speaking to Dad unless they absolutely had to. I tried staying neutral. I loved both of my parents, but neutrality became impossible. One evening, I accidentally overheard Mom laughing with one of her friends. She said something I'll never forget. Martin was always too predictable. Greg was actually exciting. She laughed. Actually laughed. The man she'd betrayed was sitting alone in a nearly empty house, while she joked about destroying his life. Something inside me changed that night. Not because of the affair. People make terrible choices every day. It was the complete lack of remorse that broke me. Dad never asked me to choose sides, not once. Whenever I visited him, he'd ask how Mom was doing, how my sisters were doing, whether everyone was healthy. He still cared about people who had stopped caring about him. That's the part that hurts the most when I think back. He never stopped being their father. They just stopped being his daughters. I had no idea then that those years would eventually lead to a decision that would tear our family apart forever. If you'd asked me back then whether my sisters would ever completely abandon our dad, I would have laughed. No matter how ugly a divorce gets, he's still your father. At least that's what I believed. I was wrong. For the first year after the divorce, Dad never stopped trying. Every Sunday evening, he'd call both of my sisters. Sometimes the calls went straight to voicemail. Sometimes they'd answer for less than a minute before making an excuse to hang up. He never complained. He'd just smile sadly and say, maybe next week. When birthdays came around, he mailed handwritten cards with checks tucked inside. Neither of them ever cashed the checks. Eventually, the envelopes started coming back unopened. I watched him quietly place every return card into a wooden box in his office. He never threw a single one away. The first Christmas after the divorce was even worse. Dad spent almost 2 weeks decorating the house because he genuinely believed we'd all celebrate together like we always had. He cooked enough food for a dozen people. He even bought gifts for Mom, despite everything she'd done. I know she probably won't come, he admitted while wrapping a scarf in silver paper, but I don't want anyone to think I stopped caring. Christmas morning came, then noon, then evening. The only person who walked through the front door was me. I found him sitting alone at the dining room table. 6 untouched place settings surrounded him. The candles had burned almost completely down. The food had gone cold. He forced a smile. More leftovers for us. I laughed because I didn't want him to see me tearing up. We ate reheated turkey in silence while holiday music played in the background. That became our new tradition. The next few years followed the same pattern. Every holiday, every birthday, every Father's Day, every invitation was ignored. My sisters posted photos online celebrating with Mom and Greg instead. The captions stung. Family is who chooses you. So thankful for the people who've always been there. The best dad isn't always your biological one. Greg was standing beside them in every picture, the same man whose affair had destroyed our family. Dad never mentioned those posts, but I knew he'd seen them. One afternoon, I walked into his office and found him staring at an old family photo. It had been taken years earlier at the beach. All 5 of us were smiling. He traced his fingers over my sisters' faces before quietly putting the picture back in its frame. I keep wondering where I went wrong. You didn't, I answered immediately. He shook his head. A good father doesn't lose 2 daughters. You didn't lose them. No, he said softly. I think they chose to leave. Not long after that, everything got even worse. Dad suffered a mild heart attack while meeting with one of his project managers. Thankfully, someone called an ambulance immediately. The doctors told him he'd recover, but only if he slowed down. I drove to the hospital as fast as I could. Mom didn't come. Neither did my sisters. Dad kept glancing toward the door every few minutes. Maybe they're stuck in traffic, he said. Hours passed. Nobody showed up. Finally, Dad asked if I could hand him his phone. He called my oldest sister first, straight to voicemail. He left a message telling her he was okay and that he simply wanted to hear her voice. Then he called my other sister. She answered. I could only hear Dad's side of the conversation. Hi, sweetheart. A pause. No, nothing serious. Another pause. I just thought, maybe. Then his shoulders slumped. He whispered, I understand. The call ended. He stared at the blank screen for nearly a minute. What did she say? I asked. He hesitated before forcing a smile. She said she's busy. I believed him. Until later that evening. Dad had accidentally left his phone unlocked on the hospital tray while he was asleep. A notification popped up. Curiosity got the better of me. It was a text from my sister. I told you not to call me unless it's an actual emergency. Another message appeared. Greg is more of a father to me than you'll ever be. Then a third. Stop trying to guilt trip us because your marriage failed. I felt sick. Dad woke up a few minutes later. He saw my face. He knew I'd read them. Without saying a word, he reached over, locked the phone, and quietly said, let's not make things worse. He was protecting the people who had just broken his heart. That was who my father was. A few months after his recovery, he started inviting me to lunch every Wednesday. At first, I thought he just wanted company. Later, I realized he was preparing me. He showed me where every important document was kept. The business records, property deeds, investment accounts, insurance policies, passwords, employee contracts. I finally asked why he was doing all this. He smiled. Because if something happens to me, someone needs to know where everything is. Nothing's going to happen. I hope you're right. Then he looked out the restaurant window for a long moment. I've spent years trying to hold together a family that no longer wants to exist. I didn't know what to say. A week later, he called and asked if I could take the afternoon off work. I need someone to come with me. Where are we going? My attorney's office. I assumed it had something to do with the company. Instead, after we sat down, his attorney slid a thick folder across the desk. My father looked at me with tired eyes. I've made a decision. When I opened the folder, the first page made my stomach drop. Last will and testament. Dad, I began. He raised a hand. I've thought about this for almost 3 years. I don't want to talk about money. This isn't about money. His voice cracked for the first time that day. It's about accepting reality. He explained that he'd reached out to my sisters dozens of times. He'd written letters, sent birthday cards, invited them to dinner, asked to meet for coffee. Every attempt had been rejected. They've made it clear they don't want a father, he said quietly. I can't force them to love me. I argued with him for nearly an hour. I begged him to leave them something, anything. He listened patiently before placing his hand on mine. If they wanted my money, they should have wanted me while I was still alive. Then he signed the papers. I left that office feeling like I'd just witnessed the end of my family. I had no idea the real storm wouldn't begin until after Dad was gone. The last year of Dad's life was strangely peaceful. Not because things had gotten better, because he'd finally stopped hoping they would. He no longer checked his phone every evening. He stopped setting extra places at the dinner table during holidays. He removed the calendar from the kitchen where he'd circled birthdays in bright red marker. It wasn't anger. It was acceptance. For the first time since the divorce, he started living for himself again. He cut back his hours at the company and promoted 2 longtime employees to help run day-to-day operations. He bought a small fishing boat, even though he'd never owned one before. Every other Saturday, we'd drive to a quiet lake just outside town. Most of the time, we didn't even fish. We just sat there talking. About work, about life, about the mistakes we'd both made. One afternoon, he looked across the water and smiled. You know what I've learned? What? You can't make someone love you by loving them harder. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say. He was right. A few weeks later, he surprised me again. I'm proud of the man you've become. Dad, no, let me finish. He leaned back in his chair. You stayed when everyone else left. Don't ever let anyone tell you loyalty doesn't matter. Those words would stay with me long after he was gone. Around the same time, I noticed something interesting. My sisters had started calling him again. Not often. Maybe once every month or two. At first I thought they were finally trying to repair the relationship. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first call came after a local newspaper published an article about Dad selling one of his commercial properties for several $1,000,000. A few hours later, my oldest sister suddenly wanted to catch up. The second call came after another magazine listed his company among the fastest growing businesses in the state. Again, she wanted to meet for lunch. Dad politely declined. He wasn't bitter. He simply recognized the timing. They're not calling because they miss me. He looked disappointed more than anything. They're calling because they miss access. Then came Thanksgiving. To everyone's surprise, both sisters actually showed up. Mom wasn't with them. Neither was Greg. Dad greeted them with genuine warmth. He hugged them both. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe we'd finally have our family back. Dinner was awkward but civil. We laughed a little, shared old memories. For about an hour, everything felt almost normal. Then my oldest sister cleared her throat. So, have you thought about retirement? Dad looked confused. A little. You must have updated your estate planning by now. The room went silent. She continued talking as if nothing was wrong. I was just thinking it would probably make sense for everyone to know how things are organized. My younger sister nodded. It avoids confusion later. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Neither could Dad. They hadn't asked how his health was. They hadn't apologized for disappearing. The first real conversation they'd had with him in years was about his estate. Dad smiled politely. My attorney has everything under control. That answer ended the discussion. They left less than 30 minutes later. Dad stood at the front window watching their car disappear down the street. I think that tells me everything I needed to know. It was the last Thanksgiving he ever celebrated. 3 months later, he collapsed at home. This time, it wasn't a heart attack. It was a massive stroke. The doctors did everything they could. For 6 days, I barely left the hospital. I slept in uncomfortable chairs. I handled paperwork. I spoke with specialists. I hoped for a miracle. When I called my sisters, neither answered. I left messages explaining how serious things were. Hours passed, then a full day. Finally, my younger sister texted, "Is he conscious?" I replied, "No." Her next message came almost immediately. "Keep us updated." That was it. No offer to come, no questions, no concern. Dad never regained consciousness. He passed away just before sunrise on a Tuesday morning. I held his hand until the very end. After the funeral, something happened that still makes me angry. People I hadn't seen in years suddenly appeared. Distant cousins, old family friends, even relatives who hadn't visited Dad once after the divorce. Everyone had stories about how much they loved him. I stood there shaking hands while wondering where all these people had been when he was eating Christmas dinner alone. The funeral itself was beautiful. More than 400 people attended, employees from the company, contractors he'd mentored, families he'd quietly helped over the years. One after another, they shared stories I'd never heard. A widow explained how Dad secretly paid her mortgage for nearly a year after her husband died in a workplace accident. A former employee admitted Dad had covered the cost of his daughter's cancer treatments. Another man revealed Dad had paid for his trade school tuition without ever asking to be repaid. I realized there was an entire side of my father I'd never fully known. He wasn't generous because he was wealthy. He became wealthy because he believed people mattered more than money. My sisters cried throughout the service. For a brief moment, I thought maybe they finally understood what they'd lost. I was wrong again. 3 days after the funeral, we met at Dad's attorney's office for the reading of the will. The conference room felt cold. Dad's attorney, Mr. Holloway, greeted everyone politely before opening a thick leather folder. He explained that Dad had updated his estate several years earlier and confirmed it again, after recovering from his first heart attack. Then he began reading. The first few pages covered charitable donations. Several longtime employees each received generous bonuses. Dad had established trust funds for the children of workers who had died while employed by his company. There were donations to the local children's hospital, the volunteer fire department, and a veterans assistance program. I smiled. That sounded exactly like him. Then Mr. Holloway reached the final section. He adjusted his glasses before reading carefully. I leave my residence, all business interests, investment accounts, retirement accounts, vehicles, real estate holdings, personal property, and all remaining assets to my son, Owen. Silence. Absolute silence. My sisters stared at the attorney. Neither of them moved. Mr. Holloway continued. My daughters shall each receive $1, acknowledging that this omission is intentional and not an oversight. My oldest sister suddenly stood up. What? Mr. Holloway calmly continued. There is also a personal letter addressed jointly to both daughters. He handed them a sealed envelope. My younger sister opened it with trembling hands. She began reading aloud before her voice broke. Dad's handwriting filled the page. My beautiful daughters, if you're reading this, it means I never found the chance to tell you goodbye. I spent years hoping we'd have one more conversation, one more holiday, one more fishing trip, one more ordinary afternoon together. Instead, I learned that love cannot survive when only one person keeps reaching across the distance. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day, but I also had to accept that you stopped choosing me long before I stopped choosing you. The greatest gift a parent can receive is not gratitude. It is simply being allowed to remain part of their children's lives. That was the one thing I wanted and the one thing I could never buy. Everything I built came from decades of sacrifice. I have chosen to leave it to the child who stood beside me when there was nothing to gain from doing so. This is not punishment. This is gratitude. I truly hope one day you find peace. I already have. Love always, Dad. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then my oldest sister slammed both hands onto the conference table. No, she pointed directly at me. You manipulated him. The room exploded. She accused me of isolating Dad, of poisoning his mind, of turning him against his own daughters. She even claimed I'd somehow forced him to rewrite his will. Mr. Holloway waited patiently until she stopped shouting. Then he quietly slid another folder across the table. Your father anticipated these allegations. Inside were medical evaluations from 3 separate physicians confirming Dad was mentally competent when he signed every version of his will. There were signed witness statements, video recordings of the documents being executed, even handwritten journal entries explaining, in Dad's own words, why he had made his decision. The attorney folded his hands. In my 38 years of estate law, I have rarely seen a will prepared this thoroughly. My oldest sister stared at the evidence for the first time in years. She had nothing to say. For a little while, after the will was read, everything went quiet. Too quiet. I knew my sisters weren't going to accept Dad's decision without a fight. I just didn't realize how far they were willing to go. About 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a thick envelope from a law firm. Inside was a notice that my sisters intended to contest the will. According to their filing, Dad had supposedly been manipulated during the final years of his life. They claimed I'd isolated him from the family, influenced his financial decisions, and convinced him to disinherit them. Reading those accusations felt like being punched in the stomach. The irony was unbelievable. For nearly a decade, I had begged them to call him, to visit him, to meet him for lunch. Every single time they refused. Now they were claiming I had somehow kept them away. Fortunately, Dad had anticipated exactly this. Mr. Holloway called me the same afternoon. You don't need to panic. I'm not. Good. Because your father planned for this possibility years ago. He invited me to his office. When I arrived, he placed 3 storage boxes on the conference table. Your father asked me not to show you these unless someone challenged the estate. Each box was labeled by year. Inside were folders, hundreds of them. Every birthday invitation Dad had mailed, every Christmas card that had been returned unopened, every email he had sent, every voicemail transcript, even certified mail receipts proving my sisters had received his letters. He had documented everything. Mr. Holloway opened another folder. This one is especially important. Inside was a notebook written entirely in Dad's handwriting. Every attempt to reconnect with my sisters had been recorded: dates, times, phone calls, visits, responses. One entry stopped me cold. May 18th. Called Rebecca to congratulate her on her promotion. No answer. Left voicemail telling her how proud I was. Received text 20 minutes later. Attached to the journal page was a printed screenshot. Please stop pretending we're close. It's embarrassing. Another entry. December 24th. Dropped off Christmas presents at both girls' houses. Packages were left on the porch the next morning. Neither wanted them. The final entry in the notebook was only 2 sentences. I forgive them. I just can't keep chasing people who keep running away. I had to excuse myself to the restroom because I couldn't stop crying. The probate hearing lasted less than a day. My sister's attorney argued that Dad had been emotionally vulnerable. Mr. Holloway responded with years of evidence showing Dad had repeatedly tried to repair the relationship, while my sisters consistently rejected him. Then he played one final piece of evidence, a video recording. Dad had insisted on making it during the signing of his final will. He looked directly into the camera. My name is Martin Callahan. Today's date is March 11th. He held up that day's newspaper. I am making this recording voluntarily because my attorney believes my estate may one day be challenged. He took a deep breath. I love all 3 of my children. Another pause. My daughters are not being excluded because of my divorce. His voice became emotional. They're being excluded because they chose to remove me from their lives. He looked straight into the camera again. If they ever claim someone forced this decision, he shook his head. No one did. This is my choice. The courtroom was completely silent. Even my sisters couldn't look at the screen. The judge ruled in less than 30 minutes. The will stood exactly as written. I assumed that would finally end everything. Instead, things somehow became worse. About a week later, both of my sisters showed up at my office without warning. I invited them into the conference room. For a moment, I actually thought they wanted to reconcile. My oldest sister smiled. It was the first friendly expression I'd seen from her in years. We've been thinking. I waited. We don't want to keep fighting. That sounded promising. Then she continued. We know the inheritance is legally yours. I nodded. But there it was. Dad would have wanted us taken care of. My younger sister slid a piece of paper across the table. It listed both of their student loans. Just under $300,000 combined. We're asking you to pay these off. I stared at the paper. Neither of them said another word. They just waited. Finally, I asked the only question that came to mind. Why would you think I'd do that? My oldest sister looked genuinely confused. Because you can. That's your reason? You inherited $10 million. Our father inherited $10 million, I corrected. No, he earned it. Silence. My younger sister sighed dramatically. You're still punishing us. I'm not punishing anyone. You know we can't afford these payments. I leaned back in my chair. And where were you when Dad couldn't afford to lose his family? Neither answered. Instead, my oldest sister crossed her arms. You've already won. This isn't about winning. It feels like it. No, I replied quietly. It feels like consequences. The meeting ended 5 minutes later. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I simply said no. I thought that would be the end of it. Instead, they started a completely different campaign. Within days, relatives I'd barely spoken to in years started contacting me. First, it was my aunt. Owen, sweetheart, family should help family. Then my uncle. $300,000 isn't much compared to what you inherited. A cousin sent me a 3-page email explaining that forgiveness required generosity. Another relative posted on social media about greedy people who cared more about money than family. They never used my name. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who they meant. At first, I ignored it. Then one afternoon, I walked into my favorite coffee shop. The owner, who had known Dad for years, looked uncomfortable. I hate asking what? Are the things people are saying true? What things? He hesitated. They're telling everyone your father wanted you to divide the estate equally, but you found a way to stop that. I couldn't believe it. My sisters weren't just asking for money anymore. They were rewriting history, again. Just like our mother had done during the divorce. That night, I sat in Dad's old study. His journal was still on the desk. The wooden box holding every unopened birthday card sat beside it. I looked around the room where he'd spent years wondering why his daughters no longer loved him. Then I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with anyone. I wasn't going to defend myself. I was simply going to tell the truth. And the truth was about to change everything. I spent the next 2 days thinking about what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore the rumors. Dad had always taken the high road. He never defended himself publicly during the divorce, even when Mom painted him as the villain. But another part of me knew something had changed. This wasn't just about me anymore. People were rewriting my father's life. They were turning a kind, generous man into someone who had supposedly abandoned his own daughters for no reason. I couldn't let that become his legacy. So instead of arguing with relatives one by one, I invited everyone to the company headquarters on a Saturday afternoon. My aunts, my uncles, my cousins, close family friends. Several people who had worked with Dad for decades. Even my sisters came, convinced I was finally going to give in. My oldest sister smiled when she walked into the conference room. "I knew you'd come to your senses." I didn't respond. When everyone had taken a seat, I stood beside the projector. "Before anyone asks me for another dollar, I want everyone to understand why Dad made the decision he did." My oldest sister rolled her eyes. "Are we really doing this?" "Yes." I pressed play. The first thing everyone saw was a timeline. Every birthday invitation Dad had mailed, every Christmas card that had been returned unopened, every voicemail transcript, every certified letter, every unanswered email. The room grew quieter with every slide. Then came the text messages. One from my younger sister, "Please stop contacting me. Greg is more of a father than you'll ever be." Another from my oldest sister, "Don't expect us to visit when you're old and lonely. That was your choice." Gasps echoed through the room. Several relatives turned to look at my sisters. Neither of them said a word. Then I played the video Dad had recorded for his attorney. When it ended, nobody moved. One of my aunts quietly began crying. An older cousin stood up and walked out without saying anything. Finally, one of Dad's oldest friends broke the silence. "I've known Martin for 40 years. He looked directly at my sisters. "He never stopped loving you." Another former employee stood. "Your father used to leave work early every birthday because he hoped one of you would call." Then another. "He kept Christmas presents for both of you in his office for years." One after another, people shared stories, things I had never even known. Dad had carried family photos in his wallet until the day he died. He celebrated every promotion my sisters received, even when they never told him personally. He quietly asked mutual friends whether they were healthy. He never spoke badly about them, not once. By the end of the afternoon, the room had completely changed. The relatives who had been criticizing me were now apologizing. One aunt hugged me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. We believed the wrong people." Another uncle admitted he'd only heard my sister's version of events. "I wish I'd asked questions before judging you." For the first time since Dad died, I felt like the truth had finally caught up with the lies. But the biggest surprise came a week later. There was a knock on my front door. It was my younger sister. She looked exhausted. Nothing like the confident woman who had demanded I pay her student loans. She held a small cardboard box. "I found these while cleaning out Mom's attic." Inside were dozens of unopened letters. Every single one was addressed to her or our older sister. Dad's handwriting covered every envelope. None of them had ever been opened. "I asked Mom about them," she whispered. "What did she say?" "She admitted she never gave them to us." I stared at her. She said she thought if we stayed close to Dad, she'd lose us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Years of anger suddenly made a little more sense. It didn't excuse the choices my sisters had made as adults, but it explained how everything had started. My younger sister began crying. I blamed him for things he never did. She sank into a chair. "I wasted almost 10 years. For nearly an hour, she apologized. Not for the inheritance, not for the money, for abandoning Dad, for ignoring his calls, for believing lies instead of asking questions. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just needed you to know how ashamed I am." It was the first sincere apology anyone in my family had offered. I accepted it. Not because the past disappeared, because carrying anger forever wouldn't honor Dad. Our older sister reacted very differently. She refused to believe the letters mattered. She insisted Dad had still favored me. She blamed Mom, then blamed me, then blamed the lawyers. Finally, she cut contact with almost everyone in the family. Sometimes people would rather lose everyone than admit they were wrong. About 6 months later, I made the decision that felt most like something Dad would have done. I didn't pay off anyone's loans. Instead, I met with the same attorney who had handled Dad's estate. Together, we created the Martin Callahan Memorial Scholarship. Every year, students who had overcome family hardship would receive help paying for college. The scholarship wasn't based only on grades. It also considered character, perseverance, and community service. The first year, we awarded 12 scholarships. Watching those students and their families celebrate reminded me of everything Dad had worked for. Not wealth, opportunity. On what would have been his 67th birthday, we held a small ceremony. Employees from the company attended. Former scholarship recipients came back to volunteer. My younger sister quietly joined us. She spent the afternoon serving food and talking with students. When everyone had left, she stood in front of Dad's portrait. I finally understand why he changed his will. I looked at her. He wasn't trying to hurt us. She wiped away a tear. He was thanking the one person who never left. I didn't know what to say, so I simply put an arm around her shoulder. We stood there together in silence. Later that evening, as I locked the doors to the company Dad had built from a single pickup truck, I realized something. People kept saying I'd inherited $10 million. They were wrong. Money wasn't the greatest thing my father left me. He left me his values, his integrity, his compassion, his belief that loyalty matters. The business continued to grow. The scholarship helped more students every year. My younger sister and I slowly rebuilt a relationship based on honesty instead of resentment. Our older sister chose a different path, and that was her decision to make. As for me, I never once regretted respecting my father's final wishes. He didn't leave me an inheritance because I was his favorite. He left it to me because when everyone else walked away, I stayed. So, audience of Reddit, I plus, AITA, for refusing to pay off my sister's $300,000 in student loans after they abandoned our father for nearly a decade, then only came back when they realized what his estate was worth.